Indian Territory, September 13, 1864. Confederate Brigadier Generals Richard Montgomery Gano and Stand Watie meet at Camp Pike in the Choctaw Nation to discuss Watie's planned raid north of the Arkansas River. The two leaders have combined their forces in what is hoped will be a lightning strike into the northern part of the Indian nations now under Union control. Spies have informed the Southern leaders of a large Union wagon supply train, which will soon leave Fort Scott, Kansas, en route to Fort Gibson, Indian Territory. Situated between the two forts is the halfway point known as the Cabin Creek Station. Federal forces have built a stockade and stationed 170 soldiers of the 2nd Indian Home Guard Regiment to protect the crossing of the Texas Road at Cabin Creek. The mere mention of Cabin Creek must have brought bitter memories to Watie. On July 1st and 2nd, 1863, Watie's command of 2,000 men had been routed by a Union force made up of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, the 6th Kansas Cavalry, and the Indian Home Guards. The Federal force had placed artillery at strategic points on a ridge overlooking the Cabin Creek Ford, which ripped the Southern lines on the opposite bank to shreds. The fighting was brutal. Watie later called the First Battle of Cabin Creek the most severest fight of any fought in the country. It is indeed ironic that on the bluffs of Cabin Creek, where Stand Watie was once handed his worst defeat, he would return to the same battleground to gain his most brilliant victory in what has been called one of the most daring raids of the American Civil War. This is Cabin Creek, located near the small town of Pensacola in what is now northeastern Oklahoma. From all appearances, there's nothing unusual about this large creek which empties into the Grand or Neosho River 3 miles distant. Like similar waterways, it is a haven for wildlife. For years, local residents passed down folklore about the battles here at Cabin Creek. Battles fought with musket, pistol, saber, and cannon. Engagements fought during the bloody conflict known today by many names. In the South, the period was and sometimes is still referred to as the War for Southern Independence. In the North, it was known as the War of the Rebellion. But the name that most historians give to the struggle is the Civil War. And as with most Civil War battles and skirmishes fought in Indian Territory, the battles at Cabin Creek are almost forgotten, except for a few historians' notes and papers. The soldiers who fought and died here were black, Indian, and white. Regiments from Kansas and Colorado, as well as Wisconsin and Texas, saw action along the Cabin Creek bluffs. And many of those who died lie buried here in unmarked and totally forgotten graves. Such was the honor often bestowed upon many Civil War soldiers. When one stands on the banks of Cabin Creek today, it seems as though you've stepped back in time. Except for the occasional sound of an airplane passing overhead, the 20th century has bypassed this corner of Oklahoma. The surrounding countryside has changed little since the mid-1860s, when the Civil War was at its bloody peak. The area around the crossing of the Texas Road at Cabin Creek is probably one of the most historic sites in the state, and perhaps even in the nation, because of a natural highway. As time passed, word spread about the Osage Trace, and the white man eventually used the trail dubbed the Immigrant Road to Texas. And so, the Texas Road became the main highway for thousands of settlers headed west. During the Civil War, the road was also used as a supply line between Fort Scott and Fort Gibson, thus acquiring the name of the Military Road or the Texas Military Road. Besides the explorers, military men, and outlaws, there was also a bold breed of pioneer men and women who traveled down the Texas road to what they hoped would be a new and better life. Joseph Lynch Martin was one of those brave pioneers. A Cherokee Indian by birth, he and his family had come to Indian Territory from Georgia over the Trail of Tears. Martin's father, John, had been the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Cherokee Nation. Joe Martin himself was well known within the Cherokee tribe and other tribal circles. Among the wealthiest landowners at the time, he owned the largest ranch in Indian Territory of well over 100,000 acres.
The Pensacola Ranch ran from what is now Ketchum, Oklahoma, down to what is now Salina, Oklahoma, all on the west side of Grand River. About 100,000 acres spread. In those days, this land belonged to the Cherokee tribe, and anyone of Cherokee blood could rent land from the tribe, and they rented it for half a cent to a cent an acre.
Martin built 2 large houses on his ranch. The first one, called Greenbrier, stood on the site of this church near Strang, Oklahoma. He built the other house just south of the Cabin Creek Ford on the Texas Road. He named this place Pensacola, which in Cherokee means land of beautiful flowers. The town of Pensacola is named for the old Martin Ranch. Both houses were furnished with the very latest fashions and furniture from St. Louis and New Orleans. Because of his house at Greenbrier, Martin was affectionately known as Greenbrier Joe for the rest of his life. Martin was also a slaveholder, owning more than 100 slaves working on his vast ranch. This gentleman is Tobe Martin. He was the son of William, the slave who rose to be overseer or foreman of Joe Martin's Pensacola Ranch. Tobe was one of slave William's sons who was born into freedom. He died in 1972 at the ripe old age of 104. One interesting story about the Martin household has been passed down over the years. Instead of using slaves as house servants, he hired 14 full-blood Cherokees as servants. He did this because he wanted his children to learn Cherokee as a second language to English. The plan backfired, however, when the children taught the Cherokee servants how to speak English. The Cabin Creek Ford was an overnight stop for settlers traveling through by wagon train. Greenbrier Joe later recalled counting over 1,000 wagons passed by his house during a 6-week period. Besides the Martin residence, ranch buildings, and slave quarters, there was also a small community which sprang up at Cabin Creek. This included a stage station, a blacksmith shop, a few other private residences, and a trading post run by a full-blood Cherokee named Tom Knight. A natural spring still runs near the old Texas Road. No doubt this spring was one of the drinking sources for the Martin household, for overnight campers, and for a base built by the Union Army sometime in the fall of 1863 after the first battle of Cabin Creek. According to numerous eyewitnesses and historical accounts, the stockade stood 12 feet high, had enclosed quarters for officers and enlisted men, and also had a hospital. However, the war would change everything for the little community at Cabin Creek. No traces of the dwellings or the stockade remain. Now the only man-made items found here are the occasional trash left by visitors, and this monument, erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1959. It commemorates the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, fought September 19th, 1864. At the outbreak of the war in 1861, Greenbrier Joe became Captain Joe Martin of Company D in Stand Watie's 2nd Cherokee Mounted Volunteers, Confederate States Army. Martin's oldest son, Alexander, and his teenage son, Richard, also joined the Confederate Army for the duration. As other Confederate Indian volunteers had done, he sent the rest of his family south, out of harm's way, to northern Texas. Martin told his slaves to watch over the ranch and both houses, and that for the time being, they were on their own. In 1863, Confederate Brigadier General Samuel B. Maxey is named commander of all Confederate forces in Indian Territory. He quickly reorganizes his command and rules that no color line would determine rank. His troops number around 2,000 among the various Indian commands. Also at his disposal is Brigadier General Richard Montgomery Gano's 5th Texas Cavalry Brigade, which has a roster of 1,800 troops. However, due to the lack of equipment and supplies, full-scale military operations have been reduced to guerrilla warfare. Bushwhacking by both sides is a common practice. General Gano is a man of many accomplishments. He graduated from Louisville Medical University at Louisville, Kentucky in 1850 before he was 21. He practiced medicine in Kentucky and was physician at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. In 1857, he moved his family to Texas, where he became famous as an Indian fighter and as a state legislator. A deeply religious man, he neither smoked tobacco, drank alcoholic beverages or stimulants, including coffee or tea, and never used foul language. Early in the war, Gano had organized and led a cavalry command known as Gano's Texas Cavalry Squadron, made up entirely of volunteers from Texas. With 200 men, he rode to Tennessee to join his good friend, General Albert Sidney Johnston. Unfortunately, Gano and his men arrived a day after the Battle of Shiloh, in which Johnston was killed. The Texas troops joined the Confederate forces, with Gano personally reporting to General P.G.T. Beauregard, commander of the Army of the Tennessee. With the help of his old family friend, General John C. Breckinridge, Gano's cavalry troop was ordered to join Colonel John Hunt Morgan's 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Gano and his Texans served with distinction as a part of Morgan's raiders. After the disastrous destruction of Morgan's command in 1863, General Gano was assigned to the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, taking command of the 5th Texas Cavalry Brigade. At the time, he was the youngest Confederate general in the sector. The remnants of his original Texas Cavalry troop, now reduced to less than company size and numbers, went with him. The unit is renamed Gano's Guards in his honor and continued to operate as a part of the 5th Texas. August 1864. The fortunes of war, which have turned against the Confederacy in the East, are being felt strongly in the Trans-Mississippi West. Since the fall of Vicksburg and the Union's iron fist control of the Mississippi River, supplies from the Confederacy to its Indian allies are few and far between. Worst of all, the civilian population in Indian Territory has suffered greatly. At the start of the war, almost 65,000 people lived in the Indian nations. By war's end, over 1/3 of the population has been killed or has moved out of the territory. Hannah Hitchcock, wife of Dr. Dwight Hitchcock, kept a diary about the suffering of non-combatants. According to eyewitness accounts like Hitchcock's, both sides, Union and Confederate, took horses and supplies from the starving populace. William P. Ross, the son of Cherokee Chief John Ross, wrote a letter around the end of December 1864 describing conditions in Indian Territory. Everything has been changed by the destroying hand of war, but few men remain in their homes. Nearly all the farms are growing up in bushes and briars, houses abandoned or burnt. Some idea of the great and melancholy change which has come over our once prosperous and beautiful country. Livestock of all kinds have become very scarce. Great increase in the number of wild animals. The wolves howl dismally over the land, and the panther's scream is often heard. A new attack plan drawn up by Stand Watie to drive the Federals from Forts Gibson and Smith has been proposed by Maxey to Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith, the commander of the Trans-Mississippi Department. The plan consists of a strong central raid into Kansas, which it is hoped would cause the withdrawal of federal troops from the various outposts in Indian Territory to protect Kansas. Maxey and his field commanders wait 7 months for a response to the plan from the Confederate Military Command. The exploits of Stand Watie are already legendary. At the start of the war, Watie was commissioned a colonel in the Confederate Army, leading his Cherokee Mounted Volunteers. Now, in 1864, he has risen in rank to Brigadier General and will hold the distinction of being the only Indian to hold a general's commission in either army during the war. And his name meant fear and apprehension to his federal enemies stationed along the territory border. His Cherokee name meant to stand firm, immovable, and Watie would stand for the Confederacy until the very end. Finally, after months of waiting, Watie's plan for a raid is approved by the Confederate Military Command. However, the raid must take place before October 1st to coincide with Major General Sterling Price's planned Missouri raid. Just 2 weeks after Gano sent his letter to Maxey, he finds that his Texas troops and Watie's Indian forces are sharing campfires at Old Camp Pike, which was located on the Canadian River near present-day Whitefield, Oklahoma. Here, ammunition is loaded, equipment is checked, and made ready as they prepare for the raid into Union-held territory. Gano takes 1,200 of his brigade, including the 29th, the 30th, and 31st Texas Cavalry, along with Captain Sylvanus Howell's Texas Artillery Battery with 6 guns. Watie has 800 soldiers, including the 1st and 2nd Cherokee Regiments, the 1st and 2nd Creek Regiments, and Colonel John Jumpa's Seminoles. Although both men retain command over their individual units, Watie readily turns command of the expedition over to Gano because his commission predates Watie's by 1 month. Both Gano and Maxey commend Watie on his unselfishness, something which up until that time had not been seen by the armies on either side. On September 14, 1864, Gano and Watie's troops began their ride into history. For 3 days, the Confederate column travels north. So far, the Southern force appears to be undetected. The column camps at Prairie Springs on the night of September 14th, then crosses the Arkansas River near the Creek Agency. The river is so swollen with recent rains, it becomes necessary to pack over all the artillery ammunition by hand and on horseback. It's difficult work. It takes more than 6 hours to cross the river with the supplies, each man having to cautiously feel for footing as the area is laced with treacherous quicksand. The Confederates then make camp at a site which Watie calls in his report Camp Pleasant. Speed is now imperative for the Confederates because of the greatly enhanced chance of Union scouts detecting such a large force. On September 16th, the Confederate force crosses the Verdigris River at the Sandtown Ford, and that afternoon discovers a Union haying party at Flat Rock, 15 miles northwest of Fort Gibson, near present-day Wagner, Oklahoma. Gano and Watie climbed to the top of a high hill, which according to local lore was here at Blue Mound, to spy on the Federal troops. Through field glasses, they see Federal troops cutting hay over a 3-mile area. In command of the 125-man Union detachment is Captain Edgar A. Barker. Unable to get an idea of the strength of the enemy force, Barker finally rides out to see for himself and runs straight into Gano's advance force. He immediately returns to his troops, positioning his small force of 2nd Kansas Cavalry with a detachment of 1st Kansas colored soldiers in a small ravine. After holding off 3 separate Confederate cavalry charges and seeing his force completely surrounded, Barker makes a command decision to leave the black infantry and mount all cavalry troops who still have their horses. They make a desperate charge at the weakest point in the Confederate line to hopefully break free and warn Fort Gibson. 65 men attempt the breakthrough charge with Barker, but only 15 manage to break through to safety. Lieutenant David M. Sutherland, Company K of the 1st Kansas Colored, is left in command of the remaining men holed up in the ravine. The Confederates begin their final advance. When the smoke clears, over 73 Union casualties litter the field. Out of 37 black troops with the detachment, only 4 are left alive. Years later, J.B. Stroud, a Confederate veteran of the battle at Flat Rock, recalled that he saw one man take his own brother prisoner. Howard Holden captured his brother John. He also remembered a son in Confederate gray capturing his own father, who was wearing Federal blue. Through some of the various 85 prisoners taken at the Federal camp, the rebel leaders learned that the expected wagon train was due any day from Fort Scott. The victorious Confederates camp on the battlefield after burning over 3,000 tons of hay, mowing machines, and all haying equipment. Gano writes in his report that the sun witnessed our complete success, and its lingering rays rested upon a field of blood. The wagon train departed Fort Scott on Monday, September 12th, en route to Fort Gibson, with its final destination being Fort Smith, Arkansas. The train consists of a total of 300 wagons, 205 government wagons, 4 government ambulances, and 91 sutler wagons. Wagons are loaded with supplies intended for the military and for the Union refugees at Fort Gibson. The train's escort is under the command of Major Henry Hopkins of the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. Hopkins, a seasoned veteran at the age of 27, is already a hero for capturing an artillery battery at the Battle of Fort Wayne in 1862. He and his battery were also present at the Battle of Honey Springs in 1863. Major Hopkins had felt it necessary to put all Union Army posts between Fort Scott and Fort Gibson on alert for possible attack by enemy forces. He had also instructed all commanders to send reinforcements to protect the wagon train. Hopkins and the train arrive at the Cabin Creek station at 9 o'clock Sunday morning, September 18th. Knowing the Federal forces at Fort Gibson are without enough horses and mules to effectively pursue his force, Gano takes his time moving up the Texas Military Road in search of the train, taking 2 days to travel 35 miles, the distance between the hay camp and Cabin Creek. Time was of the essence, as the Confederates had a good head start. But how to rush infantry 50 miles up the road in time to help save the train was a difficult question to solve. Luckily for Wattles, the Union commander at Fort Gibson, help was camped nearby. Colonel James M. Williams and his 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, now renamed the 79th U.S. Colored Volunteers, have just arrived from Fort Smith. Williams is the same commander who only a year before had handed Stand Watie his worst defeat in the first Battle of Cabin Creek. After a brief discussion, Williams suggests to Wattles that he round up wagons and mule teams in order to rush Williams' black troops and supplies up the Texas Military Road as fast as possible. Gano's main force camps on Wolf Creek near the present town of Salina. Confident that the train has not passed, Gano takes 400 men and 2 pieces of artillery up the Texas Road to reconnoiter and finds the wagon train parked at the station on Cabin Creek. It is Sunday afternoon, September 18th. Major Hopkins, not realizing the danger the train was in, has not ordered the government wagons parked in any type of defensive or corral formation. Instead, the wagons are haphazardly spread 1.5 miles to the south of the stockade, parking in open order style, each team about 30 feet apart. A group of sutler wagons are parked on the ridge on the east side of Cabin Creek, overlooking the crossing. Over 1,800 mules and horses are leisurely grazing on the prairie in front of the stockade. Gano immediately sizes up the situation and sends a courier to tell Watie to bring up the rest of the Confederate column. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, September 19th, 1864, the Confederates form a line of battle and move to within 500 yards of the Federal stockade. In the bright moonlight, they can see the stockade with what appears to be immense earthworks positioned to the front. The Confederates form a double line with cavalry at the front and infantry immediately behind. The rebels advance, and Federal musketry greets them. The Confederates immediately answer with a thunderous cannonading of the stockade. That's something Major Hopkins is totally unprepared for. Well, the sound of the cannon panics the mule team, still hitched to the wagons. And in the blackness, the mules drag some of the wagons off of these 100-foot bluffs into the creek below. The Confederates closed to within 300 yards of the Federal position as Howell's 6-gun battery continues firing solid shot and exploding shell, creating sheer pandemonium in the Union camp. One eyewitness wrote, "Soldiers, teamsters, mules, and wagons, in a perfect cyclone of excitement, went flying back toward the timber. Some men mounted the unhitched mules where they could catch them, only to be thrown off again by the frantic animals. Some ran on foot among the wildly rushing torrent of men, wagons, and animals. Teams and parts of teams, dragging their wagons without guidance, crashed into each other as they turned from the rebel fire in their front and raced madly for timber in the rear. Without waiting for orders, the teamsters, civilians, and soldiers alike hastily grabbed horses and saddle mules to retreat back up the Texas Road in the direction of Fort Scott." Dr. George A. Moore, a dentist from Leavenworth, Kansas, was in the Cabin Creek stockade that fateful night. Years later, he recounted the events of that night. Our soldiers, mistaking the sounds of hoofs of a runaway band of mules for those of a charging body of Confederate cavalry, discharged a volley of musketry, and the scene of confusion that followed is indescribable. The teams of mules, stampeded and entirely beyond control, were running in various directions, and I was in the midst of the tumult. The wild grass was so high that I could not see the teams until they were almost upon me, and no sooner did I spring from before one team than I would find myself directly in front of another. It seemed almost miraculous that I escaped injury. At this point in the battle, one question still remains. During the Confederate onslaught, where was Major Henry Hopkins? Dr. Moore went on record writing that Major Hopkins placed me in command of a small company of Indian soldiers and informed me that he would immediately make an attempt to meet and hasten the coming reinforcements, said to be but a few miles distant. Another eyewitness, Captain Nathaniel B. Lucas of the 6th Kansas Cavalry, commanded a company under Hopkins. He told a newspaper reporter, "I heard officers asking anxiously, 'Where's Major Hopkins? Who's in command?' Hopkins was nowhere to be found. He had abandoned the outfit and struck out for the Grand River on his way to Fort Gibson." With the moon now down, Gano and Watie have no real idea of what is happening and decide to wait until daybreak to continue the attack. The shooting slowly stops. Daybreak reveals what Gano and Watie have been waiting for, the exact position of the train and its defenders. In the early morning light, they can also see what they thought were earthworks are in reality only huge hay ricks. Gano rearranges his artillery, moving one section of Howell's battery to the Federal right flank. Now, the Southern cannons are within 100 yards of the Union fortification. The Confederates continue the unrelentless bombardment of the stockade with shot and shell. This move pins down the Federal troops in a murderous artillery crossfire, pounding their resistance in the ground. The 6-gun Confederate artillery belches round after round of canister at the Union position. The effect of the canister and grape shot was devastating. It can be described as being like a huge shotgun blast, as lead and iron balls, some up to 1.5 inches in diameter, are hurled toward an enemy with a range of 200 to 400 yards. Gano decides to press his advantage in one final charge. He orders Lieutenant Colonel Otis G. Welch, commanding the 29th Texas, Captain Strayhorn and the 30th Texas, along with Major Morant and Martin's regiment, to the opposite end of the Confederate line to sweep around and flank the Federal right. Meanwhile, Colonel John Jumper's Creek and Seminole troops, having fallen back to replenish their ammunition, return to the front line and begin firing volley after volley at the Union defenders. This combination attack of men and artillery proves too much for the Federals, who suddenly give way. The rebel yell reverberates again and again as the Confederate line begins its final advance. Now, with no hope of holding out for reinforcements to arrive, the remaining Union troops make good their escape along the Brushy Creek bottom. The Southerners pursue the retreating Federals for several miles, capturing some and killing those who put up a fight. By 9 o'clock on the morning of September 19, 1864, the Second Battle of Cabin Creek is over. This time, the Confederates are victorious. They have complete control of the field. General Watie gallops into the stockade shouting, "Hurrah for General Gano," and is quickly joined in the cheer by both Texans and Indians. In their haste to escape, the Union force has left their dead and wounded on the field. Casualties are few considering the number of troops involved in the engagement. Union losses are reported at 54 killed, missing, or wounded, while the Confederate leaders report 45 killed, wounded, or missing. Burial details are assembled to bury the Confederate dead, and the wounded are tended to as the Southern troops gather the serviceable wagons for the return trip south. 130 wagons and 740 mules survive the battle and are swung into line. The goods and provisions in the captured train are estimated to be worth over $1,500,000. The spoils include clothing, which the Confederates gleefully exchange for their rags. The Union stockade is put to the torch, along with 3,000 tons of hay and all equipment. The wagon train travels for only 1 hour before scouts make contact with the relief troops of the 79th U.S. Colored Regiment. At George May's farm near Pryor's Creek, Gano forms his line for battle, but keeps the Union troops at a distance with skirmish fire. At 4:30 in the afternoon, an artillery duel begins between the two forces and lasts until dark. Colonel Williams decides against a direct frontal assault because his men are exhausted after a 50-mile forced march. It will prove to be a costly decision. As night cloaks the battleground, General Gano orders his soldiers to build campfires. But this is just one part of a bold ruse. One of the wagons is emptied and driven over rocky ground near the creek. This gives the impression to Union pickets that the wagon train is being parked for the night. For 2 hours, the empty wagon is driven back and forth as the actual wagon train slips away to the northwest. The Federals awake to find the train is gone, but due to their weakened condition, cannot pursue. Williams pulls his force back to the hay camp at Flat Rock. Determined, the Confederate raiders do not sleep for the next 3 days and nights as they race for the Arkansas River and safety. The Southern column crosses the Verdigris River at Claremore Mound near Captain Clem Rogers' place. Rogers, a scout for Watie, will be the father of world-renowned humorist Will Rogers. The column continued on to Tulseytown, where the wagon train crossed the Arkansas River at a place still known today as Gano's Crossing. This is Gano's Crossing as it appears today, just north of the 11th Street Bridge on the Arkansas River in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The news of the captured wagon train traveled quickly. Headlines, along with official dispatches, appeared in the September 27, 1864 edition of the New York Times. From Fort Scott, government train captured and burned at Cabin Creek. Stand Watie in strong force moving north. Loss, 2 million. After the train was safely in Confederate territory, the spoils were divided among the hungry army. Watie refused to take any of the supplies, but his men realized the need of his family, loaded a wagon with food and clothing, and sent it to Mrs. Watie. The captured train gave a much-needed boost to the low morale of the Trans-Mississippi Department. On January 19, 1865, a joint resolution of both houses of the Confederate Congress commends Gano and Watie on their daring and skill in the capture of the wagon train on the 19th of September, 1864. Trans-Mississippi Department Commander Edmund Kirby Smith publishes his own congratulatory order from his headquarters in Shreveport, Louisiana.
General Orders number S1, October 12, 1864. The General Commanding announces to the Army the complete success of one of the most brilliant raids of the war. The expedition under Brigadier Generals Gano and Stand Watie, penetrating far within the enemy's lines, has captured his forage camp and train, destroyed 5,000 tons of hay, and brought out 130 captured wagons loaded with stores after destroying as many more which were disabled in the action. These, with 135 prisoners and more than 200 of the enemy killed and wounded, attest the success of the expedition. The celebrity of the movement, the dash of the attack, and their entire success entitle the commands engaged to the thanks of the country.
Well, just as the capture of the wagon train boosted Southern morale, it also put fear into the hearts of the people of Kansas and Missouri. Now, just about everybody was seeing a rebel behind some bush or some tree, depending on who you talk to. The governor of Kansas even called out the state militia to meet that anticipated Confederate attack. Why, Stand Watie was reported to be attacking several places all at the same time. But the Second Battle of Cabin Creek was the last major military operation of the Civil War in Indian Territory, and perhaps there's some justice in the fact that the final battle in the territory was a Confederate victory, even though the rebel forces were plagued by shortages, disappointments, and defeats all throughout the war. The Union juggernaut continued onward, and the war ended in the East 7 months later. On June 25th, 1865, in the town of Dokesville, Choctaw Nation, Stand Watie and his command formally and officially ceased hostilities. With the stroke of a pen, Watie signed this document, making him the last Confederate general to surrender. Only a few years after the war, the sutlers and the owners of the goods and the wagons he had helped purloin at Cabin Creek tried to sue him for the loss. However, the rough years of campaigning took their toll on Watie's health, and he died in 1871. He's buried here at the Polson Cemetery near the Oklahoma-Arkansas state line. Monuments to Stand Watie stand just outside the cemetery. Near the end of the war, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery Gano was reassigned to Richmond, Virginia. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Gano was approached by several ex-Confederate leaders wanting to continue the Confederate cause in Mexico. Gano declined. The man who was wounded only once in 78 engagements of the Civil War faithfully served as an ordained minister of the Christian Church for 45 years. He and his family prospered in the Dallas area. He and his brother John Allen Gano engaged in the business of importing and selling shorthorn cattle and blood-trotting horses from Kentucky. Gano started a family tradition which was later carried on by his great-grandson, billionaire Howard Hughes. Gano was also instrumental in the formation of the United Confederate Veterans Organization in Texas and was the featured speaker at several Confederate reunions. He died in March 1913 at the age of 83. General Gano is buried here in the Oakland Cemetery in Dallas, Texas, surrounded by his wife and children. Henry Hopkins had to live with the humiliating defeat at Cabin Creek the rest of his life. Hopkins was officially mustered out in January 1865. He later served as the warden of the Kansas State Penitentiary for 13 years. He was also appointed a commissioner for the Kansas Railroad Commission. Major Hopkins died December 18, 1883, at the age of 46. In his golden years, Greenbrier Joe Martin wrote for the Veneta Chieftain and other newspapers under the pen name of Greenbrier Joe. He, like many other Southern men, had seen his home and his prosperity and his way of life vanish, never to return. Greenbrier Joe Martin died of pneumonia in November 1891. Many throughout the Cherokee Nation grieved at his passing. Some of his family and friends said that Uncle Joe died of a broken heart. Greenbrier Joe Martin was laid to rest at the burial site he had selected, only about 25 yards from the Grand River, which he loved. Richard Martin inherited his father's Rock Creek plantation and built this house on the plantation in 1880. And this is the house as it still stands today, just outside Pensacola. In 1907, Martin tried to file a claim against the government for the destruction of the Martin Ranch at Cabin Creek. This letter cut that claim short when Martin was told he had to prove he was loyal to the Union during the war. And a legend lives on today at Cabin Creek that in these parts rivals the stories of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. Now, the story has to do with a cannon that was supposedly knocked from its emplacement on the Cabin Creek bluffs. This was during the Second Battle. Just a story, you say? Well, over the years, many people claim they saw that cannon and even touched it.
Well, Daddy Martin was going to take our Bill and my two little sons to swim one summer, and he said, well, I'll go with you. So we went and walked along the creek, and all at once I looked over, and here was this cannon down in the water. And I said, well, Daddy Martin, that's a cannon in there. Look, at the whole carriage was out, the main part and one wheel, all showing. And he said, oh, that's just an old Civil War cannon. And he said, see those gouge marks in the bank there? Said there was a cannon in every one. But I never could get him to get them out. I just begged for ages to go back and get the thing out of the creek.
16 Union soldiers who died at Cabin Creek and 12 Union dead from Flat Rock were moved to the Fort Gibson National Cemetery in 1867. They now lie side by side at rest in the soil that they fought to defend, identified only by grave numbers which mark their final resting place. For the rest of the Union and Confederate dead still buried at Cabin Creek, there is this monument to remember the Confederate victory, and there are these smaller monuments designed to give the visitor an idea of which direction the Southern attack came from, as well as the Union defense positions. And maybe they also serve to remind us of a different time, when Indian, black and white, slaves, freemen, neighbors and brothers, Americans all, went to war against each other.
The year was 1864, thousands died to fight no more in that awful struggle called the Civil War. In the east, Atlanta fell, Petersburg a living hell, out west the rebels left to fight alone. The war out west had gone 3 years, they had walked the trail.
If you enjoyed this program, you can purchase the feature-length version of the documentary Last Raid at Cabin Creek on Amazon.com.